The Women's March on Versailles, also known as the October March, the October Days, or simply the March on Versailles, was one of the earliest and most significant events of the French Revolution. The march began among women in the marketplaces of Paris who, on the morning of the 5th of October 1789, were rioting over the high price and scarcity of bread. Their demonstrations quickly became intertwined with the activities of revolutionaries, who were seeking liberal political reforms and a constitutional monarchy for France. The market women and the various allies grew into a mob of thousands and, encouraged by revolutionary agitators, they ransacked the city armory for weapons and marched to the Palace of Versailles. The crowd besieged the palace and, in a dramatic and violent confrontation, they successfully pressed their demands upon King Louis XVI. The next day, the crowd compelled the king, his family, and most of the French assembly to return with them to Paris. These events ended the king's independence and signified the change of power and reforms about to overtake France. The march symbolized a new balance of power that displaced the ancient privileged orders of the French nobility and favored the nation's common people, collectively termed the Third Estate, bringing together people representing sources of the revolution in their largest numbers yet. The March on Versailles proved to be a defining moment of that revolution. Background: the deregulation of the grain market implemented by Turgot, Louis XVI, Comptroller General of Finances, in 1774, was the main cause of the famine which led to the Flour War in 1775. At the end of the Ancien regime, the fear of famine became an ever-present dread for the lower strata of the Third Estate, and rumors of the Pacte de famine, to starve the poor, were still rampant and readily believed. Mere rumors of food shortage led to the Réveillon riots in April 1789. Rumors of a plot aiming to destroy wheat crops in order to starve the population provoked the great fear in the summer of 1789. When the October Journées took place, France's revolutionary decade, 1789 to 1799, had barely begun. The revolution's capacity for violence was as yet not fully realized. The storming of the Bastille had occurred less than 3 months earlier. Flush with newly discovered power, the common citizens of France, particularly in the teeming capital, Paris, felt a newly discovered desire to participate in politics and government. The poorest among them were almost exclusively concerned with the issue of food. Most workers spent nearly half their income on bread. In the post-Bastille period, price inflation and severe shortages in Paris became commonplace, as did local incidents of violence in the marketplaces. The King's Court and the deputies of the National Constituent Assembly were all uncomfortable residents at the royal city of Versailles, where they were considering momentous changes to the French political system. Reformist deputies had managed to pass sweeping legislation in the weeks after the Bastille's fall, including the revolutionary August decrees and the Declaration of the Rights of Man of the Citizen. Now their attention was turned to the creation of a permanent constitution. Monarchists and conservatives of all degrees had thus far been unable to resist the surging strength of the reformers. But by September their positions were beginning, however slightly, to improve. In constitutional negotiations they were able to secure a legislative veto power for the king. Many of the reformers were left aghast by this, and further negotiations were hobbled by contentiousness. Quiet Versailles, the seat of royal power, was a stifling environment for reformers. Their stronghold was in Paris. The bustling metropolis lay within walking distance, less than 21 kilometers to the northeast. The reformist deputies were well aware that the 400 or more monarchist deputies were working to transfer the assembly to the distant, royalist city of Tours, a place even less hospitable to their efforts than Versailles. Worse, many feared that the king, emboldened by the growing presence of royal troops, might simply dissolve the assembly, or at least renege on the August decrees. The king was indeed considering this, and when on the 18th of September he issued a formal statement giving his approval to only a portion of the decrees, the deputies were incensed. Stoking their anger even further, the king even stated on the 4th of October that he had reservations about the Declaration of the Rights of Man. Early plans. Despite its post-revolutionary mythology, the march was not a spontaneous event. Numerous calls for a mass demonstration at Versailles had already been made. The Marquis of St. Paraga, one of the popular orators of the Palais Royal, had called for just such a march in August to evict the obstructionist deputies who, he claimed, were protecting the king's veto power. Although his efforts were foiled, revolutionaries continued to hold on to the idea of a march on Versailles to compel the king to accept the Assembly's laws. Speakers at the Palais Royal mentioned it regularly throughout the next month, creating enduring suspicions of the proprietor, Louis Philippe II, Duke of Orleans. The idea of a march on Versailles was widespread, and was even discussed in the pages of the Mercure de France. A menacing unrest was in the air, and many nobles and foreigners fled the oppressive atmosphere. Royal banquet. Following the mutiny of the French guards a few hours before the storming of the Bastille, the only troops immediately available for the security of the palace at Versailles were the aristocratic Garde du Corps and the Saint-Suisses. Both were primarily ceremonial units and lacked the numbers and training to provide effective protection for the royal family and the government. Accordingly, the Flanders Regiment was ordered to Versailles in late September 1789 by the king's Minister of War, the Comte de Saint-Priest, as a precautionary measure. On the 1st of October, the officers at Versailles held a welcoming banquet for the officers of the new troops, a customary practice when a unit changed its garrison. The royal family briefly attended the affair, walking amongst the tables set up in the opera house of the palace. Outside, in the Cour de Marbre, the soldiers' toasts and oaths of fealty to the king grew more demonstrative as the night wore on. The lavish banquet was certain to be an affront to those suffering in a time of severe austerity, but it was reported in the L'Ami du Peuple and other firebrand newspapers as nothing short of a gluttonous orgy. Worst of all, the papers all dwelt scornfully on the reputed desecration of the tricolour cockade. Drunken officers were said to have stamped upon this symbol of the nation and professed their allegiance solely to the white cockade of the House of Bourbon. This embellished tale of the royal banquet became the source of intense public outrage. Beginning of the march. On the morning of the 5th of October, a young woman struck a marching drum at the edge of a group of market women who were infuriated by the chronic shortage and high price of bread. From their starting point in the markets of the eastern section of Paris, then known as the Faubourg Saint-Antoine, the angry women forced a nearby church to toll its bells. Their numbers continued to grow, and with restless energy the group began to march. More women from other nearby marketplaces joined in, many bearing kitchen blades and other makeshift weapons. As the tocsins rang from church towers throughout several districts, driven by a variety of agitators, the mob converged on the Hôtel de Ville, where they demanded not only bread, but arms. As more and more women and men arrived, the crowd outside the city hall reached between 6,000 and 7,000, and perhaps as many as 10,000. One of the men was the audacious Stanislas Marie Maillard, a prominent vainqueur of the Bastille, who eagerly snatched up his own drum and led the infectious cry of Versailles. Maillard was a popular figure among the market women, and by unofficial acclamation was given a leadership role. Although outwardly a gentleman, Maillard helped suppress by force of character the mob's worst instincts. He rescued the Hôtel de Ville's quartermaster, Pierre-Louis Lefebvre-Laroche, a priest commonly known as Abbé Lefebvre, who had been strung up on a lamppost for trying to safeguard its gunpowder storage. The Hôtel de Ville itself was ransacked as the crowd surged through, taking its provisions and weapons, but Maillard helped prevent it from burning down the entire building. In due course, the rioters' attention turned again to Versailles, and they filtered back to the streets. Maillard deputized a number of women as group leaders and gave a loose sense of order to the proceedings as he led the crowd out of the city in the driving rain. As they left, thousands of National Guardsmen who had heard the news were assembling at the Place de Grève. The Marquis de Lafayette, Indiana Paris as their commander-in-chief, discovered to his dismay that his soldiers were largely in favor of the march and were being egged on by agitators to join in. Even though he was one of France's greatest war heroes, Lafayette could not dissuade his troops, and they began threatening to desert, rather than see them leave as another anarchic mob. The Parisian municipal government told Lafayette to guide their movements. They also instructed him to request that the king return voluntarily to Paris to satisfy the people. Sending a swift horseman forward to warn Versailles, Lafayette contemplated the near mutiny of his men. He was aware that many of them had openly promised to kill him if he did not lead or get out of the way. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, 15,000 guards with several thousand more civilian latecomers set off for Versailles. Lafayette reluctantly took his place at the head of their column, hoping to protect the king and public order. Goals of the march. The hunger and despair of the market women was the original impetus for the march. But what started as a search for bread soon took on a much more ambitious goal. The Hôtel de Ville had already opened its plentiful stores to the rioters, but they remained unsatisfied. They wanted not just one meal but the assurance that bread would once again be plentiful and cheap. Famine was a real and ever-present dread for the lower strata of the Third Estate, and rumors of an aristocrat's plot to starve the poor were rampant and readily believed. At the same time, there was common resentment against the reactionary attitudes prevailing in court circles even before the uproar sparked by the notorious banquet precipitated the political aspects of the march. Deeper planners in the crowd spread the word that the king needed to dismiss his royal bodyguards entirely and replace them all with patriotic National Guardsmen, a line of argument that had a compelling resonance among Lafayette's soldiers. These two popular goals coalesced around a third that was largely the revolutionaries' idea, which was that the king and his court, and the assembly as well, must all be moved to Paris to reside among the people. Only then would the foreign soldiers be expelled, food be reliably available, and France served by a leader who was in communion with his own people. The plan appealed to all segments of the crowd. Even those who were innocently supportive of the monarchy felt the idea of bringing home Le Bon Papa was a good and comforting plan. For revolutionaries, the preservation of their recent legislation and the creation of a constitution were paramount, and a lockdown of the king within reformist Paris would provide the best possible environment for the revolution to succeed.